In the middle of Patagonia, in a remote valley in southern Argentina, 4 hours from the nearest city, there is a Chinese space tracking station. It was approved by executive decree signed by Argentine President Cristina Fernandez in 2012. It was not voted on by the Argentine Congress. When Argentine legislators later tried to review the full terms of the agreement, the Chinese side refused to provide complete disclosure. The station is operated by the CLTC, the China Satellite Launch and Tracking Control, which is subordinate to the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force. China describes the facility as a civilian installation for deep space exploration. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency has assessed that the station has the technical capability to track and potentially interfere with American satellites in orbit. The United States military classifies it as a high strategic risk. It is 12,000 kilometers from Beijing. It is in the Western Hemisphere, the geographic region the United States declared its exclusive sphere of influence 200 years ago. The Monroe Doctrine has never been revoked. The Panama Canal moves approximately 5% of global trade annually. For the United States specifically, it is the primary maritime route between the East Coast and the West Coast. Every American aircraft carrier that moves from the Atlantic to the Pacific transits the Panama Canal. Every container ship carrying goods between American ports on opposite coasts uses the canal. The canal was built by the United States at a cost of approximately $400 million and more than 5,000 lives. It was operated by the United States for most of the 20th century. It was transferred to Panama in 1999. Today, the ports at both ends of the canal, Balboa on the Pacific side and Cristobal on the Atlantic side, are operated by Hutchison Ports, a company headquartered in Hong Kong, with significant ties to the government of that territory. The company controls port operations at both entrances to the canal, through which American military vessels and commercial shipping regularly transit. The United States government has expressed concern about this arrangement. It has not changed it. Since 2005, China has invested approximately $150 billion in infrastructure across Latin America and the Caribbean. That figure, compiled by the Inter-American Dialogue's China-Latin America Finance Database, represents loans, equity investments, and construction contracts across more than 20 countries. It is more than the United States has invested in the region through official development programs in the same period. The investments are not random. They follow the region's choke points with notable geographic precision. Deep water ports on both coasts, hydroelectric dams on major river systems, telecommunications networks in major cities, roads connecting resource extraction sites to export terminals, and at least one installation capable of monitoring American satellites from the southern tip of the hemisphere. Every investment has a commercial justification. Every investment also has a strategic implication that the United States has been slow to acknowledge and slower still to respond to. So let's map what was built, port by port, installation by installation, country by country, while the United States was looking somewhere else. In November 2024, Chinese President Xi Jinping participated by video link from Beijing in the inauguration ceremony for the port of Chancay in Peru. It is the largest deep-water port on the Pacific coast of South America. It was built entirely by COSCO Shipping, a Chinese state-owned enterprise that is one of the world's largest shipping companies. COSCO has exclusive operational rights to Terminal 1 under a 60-year concession agreement. The terms give COSCO control over which ships enter the terminal, what cargo can be inspected by whom, and what operational information is shared with the Peruvian government. The U.S. Southern Command has formally identified Chancay as a port that could support Chinese naval logistics in the Pacific without requiring a permanent military base designation, because the infrastructure to support naval operations would already be in place. In Cuba, the port of Mariel was modernized with Chinese financing. It is 145 kilometers from Miami. It is closer to the Florida coast than Havana was in 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the United States to the edge of nuclear conflict over foreign military infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. In Argentina, the port of Ushuaia, the southernmost commercial port in the world, the primary gateway for Antarctic supply operations, has received Chinese investment in port expansion and logistics infrastructure. China has a growing presence in Antarctic research and logistics. Ushuaia is the door. Each port has a commercial function. Each port is also a position on a strategic map that someone in Beijing is reading very carefully. The ports are the visible layer. The digital infrastructure is not. Huawei has built or is currently building 4G and 5G telecommunications networks in more than a dozen countries across Latin America. In Brazil, the hemisphere's largest country, with 215 million people, Huawei holds contracts with the three largest mobile carriers. Huawei is a central participant in Brazil's 5G rollout. The United States spent years applying diplomatic pressure to allies worldwide to exclude Huawei from 5G networks, on the documented grounds that Huawei infrastructure can provide the Chinese government with access to communications data flowing through those networks. European allies largely complied after considerable resistance. Most of Latin America did not comply. The cost of exclusion, higher equipment prices, delayed deployment timelines, was not offset by American alternatives of equivalent price and capability. In addition to the terrestrial network, Chinese state companies are participating in submarine cable projects connecting Latin America to Asia, building the digital infrastructure that will carry the hemisphere's internet traffic through Chinese-operated routes, parallel to and separate from the Western cable networks documented in the previous episode of this series. The ports move goods, the cables move data, the space station tracks satellites. China is building all three, in the same hemisphere, under the same doctrine that said no foreign power could. The Chinese space tracking station in Patagonia is the clearest example of what analysts call dual-use infrastructure, facilities with a declared civilian function and an assessed military capability. China's documentation of the facility emphasizes deep space exploration. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency's documentation emphasizes satellite tracking and monitoring. Both descriptions are accurate. The same antenna that tracks distant spacecraft can track objects in low Earth orbit. The same facility that serves civilian science serves the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, which operates it. This is the pattern across the hemisphere. A commercial port that can berth military vessels, a telecommunications network that can collect communications data, a space tracking station that can monitor American orbital assets. None of these individually constitute a military base. Together, they constitute a strategic infrastructure that does not need to be called a military base to function like one. In 2018, Admiral Craig Fowler, then commander of U.S. Southern Command, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. He described Chinese infrastructure investment in Latin America as a strategic challenge, requiring a coordinated and sustained American response. He was specific about the risks: port access for naval vessels, telecommunications infrastructure enabling surveillance, space facilities providing monitoring capability. In 2020, his successor, General Mark Milley, repeated substantially the same assessment. In 2022, General Laura Richardson used the phrase "competition for influence" to describe what was happening in the region under her command. In 2024, the same warnings were repeated in virtually identical language by yet another Southcom commander. 4 consecutive commanders, 6 years of testimony. The same strategic concern expressed in the same terms to the same committees. The warnings have been consistent. The investment gap has widened. In 2021, the Biden administration announced the Build Back Better World Initiative, B3W, described as a values-driven, high-standard alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative for developing nations worldwide. By 2022, B3W had been rebranded as the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. By 2023, the initiative had produced a small number of announced projects in several regions. The Port of Chancay was inaugurated in 2024. The American alternative to Chancay, a Western-backed, U.S.-supported deep-water port on South America's Pacific coast, does not exist. The warnings have been issued since 2018. The investment gap has widened every year. The alternative port does not exist. In 1823, President James Monroe delivered his annual message to Congress. Embedded in that message was a declaration that would define American foreign policy for 2 centuries. The Western Hemisphere was not open to further colonization by European powers. Any attempt by a European nation to extend its political system to any portion of this hemisphere would be considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. The Monroe Doctrine was never passed by Congress. It was never ratified as a treaty. It was a presidential statement that became the foundational doctrine of American foreign policy in the Americas. It has never been revoked. China did not challenge the Monroe Doctrine. China does not recognize the Monroe Doctrine as a legitimate principle of international law. China simply began investing in every country in the hemisphere that the United States was not investing in, and doing so through commercial mechanisms that the doctrine was never designed to address. While the United States was fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, wars that cost more than $2 trillion over 2 decades, China was signing port concession agreements in Peru, Chile, Ecuador, and Cuba. While the United States was managing the financial crisis of 2008 and its decade-long aftermath, China was financing hydroelectric dams in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Argentina. While the United States was consumed by a decade of political division at home, China was laying fiber optic cables along the Pacific coast, installing telecommunications infrastructure in capital cities, and building the space station in Patagonia that the U.S. military would later assess as a high strategic risk. Not with military force, with infrastructure, with loans, with technical assistance, with $150 billion, with patience. The Monroe Doctrine was never designed for this. I want to be precise about what I am and am not arguing here. I am not arguing that China has no right to invest in Latin America. Countries have the right to choose their economic partners. Latin American nations have the right to accept infrastructure investment from whoever offers it on terms they find acceptable. What I am arguing is geographic. Infrastructure shapes geography. Geography shapes strategy. Strategy shapes power. A Chinese-operated deep-water port on South America's Pacific coast is a geographic fact with strategic implications, regardless of the commercial justification for its existence. A Chinese space tracking station in Patagonia, capable of monitoring American satellites, is a geographic fact, regardless of the diplomatic mechanism by which it was permitted to be built. The 9 episodes of this series have mapped cobalt, shipping lanes, drug supply chains, military bases, criminal distribution networks, rare earth dependencies, submarine cables, gold routes, and now infrastructure across the Americas. Each episode has the same structure, a geography that was changing while most people were looking elsewhere, a warning that was issued and not adequately responded to, a map that is substantially different today than it was 20 years ago. The Monroe Doctrine declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to foreign powers 200 years ago. China has spent $150 billion building infrastructure here in the last 20 years. What exactly does the doctrine still mean?